Muchas gracias a todas las personas que os habéis inscrito y que habéis venido a este primer seminario que organizamos conjuntamente entre el Instituto Meridiano y el Instituto de Historia del CSIC, que hemos titulado Ecología y extrema derecha. En otras ocasiones hemos organizado seminarios y encuentros aquí en ECOO ya hace unos años, y como hay una cita que a mí me gusta mucho y creo que dice mucho de nuestra situación política precisamente respecto a la crisis climática y a la extrema derecha, que es que los problemas están yendo a peor, pero las soluciones están yendo a mejor. Entonces yo creo que vivimos en una situación un poco extrema, ¿no? Como vemos muchos avances respecto a la transición muy prometedores y muy interesantes, y respecto a hace unos años vemos como la extrema derecha está yendo para sus estándares mucho mejor, para los nuestros está yendo la situación bastante peor. Entonces nos parecía interesante hablar precisamente sobre estos temas y sobre el cruce de estas dos crisis tan importantes como son la crisis climática y la del auge de la extrema derecha. Antes de empezar con las presentaciones, voy a ser muy breve porque tenemos como 1 hora y media para esta primera mesa. Haremos una pausa muy breve y luego daremos paso a la siguiente. Breves apuntes. El primero es que, como sabéis, os habéis podido inscribir de manera gratuita a este seminario, pero con todo, desde Instituto Meridiano agradecemos que, si queréis, entréis en nuestra web y vayáis a la sección de apoyo para que podáis colaborar, para que sigamos organizando más eventos como este y con más frecuencia y con más alcance, si es que eso es posible. Lo segundo es que tenemos algunos libros sobre precisamente estas temáticas, ¿no? Ecología, extrema derecha, revistas. Tenemos una preciosa camiseta que también está a la venta, por si queréis luego echarle un vistazo en la pausa o al final. Y nada, voy a pasar directamente a las presentaciones para darles espacio y tiempo a los ponentes. Esta primera mesa, como sabéis, va a tratar de fascismo y del uso de las redes sociales y de cómo la extrema derecha está utilizando precisamente las redes sociales para expandir sus mensajes específicamente medioambientales, sus visiones, sus imaginarios, para fermentar una psicología muy particular en torno a todos estos temas. Y para hablar de ello tenemos dos invitados de excepción. Richard Hames, que es periodista y escritor, y que junto a Alex Roberts es autor de 2 libros, Post-Internet Far Right, y aparte también es autor de Baterías, bombas y fronteras, que hemos traducido y que lo tenéis también disponible en la mesa. Ha sido editor de Crude Futures y presentador de Do Your Own Research para Nueva Era Media, y el libro en el que está trabajando tratará sobre colapsos y hundimientos sociales. Y también contaremos con Saoirse Gallagher, que es académica, doctora por la Universidad de Florida, especializada en mitología política comparativa, y sus investigaciones actuales se centran en el análisis literario de las narrativas del declive en el pensamiento político moderno, y también está trabajando en su primer libro. Las 2 ponencias serán en inglés. Ahí arriba tenéis aparatos para traducir, por si lo necesitáis. Habrá traducción simultánea y, sin más, dejo el paso. Hablaré a Richard primero y muchas gracias a los dos por haber viajado, por venir hasta Madrid para asistir a este seminario.
Shall I begin? It feels very narcissistic to only recognize the names of things that I wrote. It feels like I'm only exclusively interested in, thank you for this introduction. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I am going to be talking about the very, very broad topic of the far right on the internet, which is something that has changed an enormous amount, of course, about over the last, say, 15, 16 years. The book that was mentioned earlier, Post-Internet Far Right, which does not yet have a Spanish translation, but may well do at some point too. There'll be another edition as well, which will be updated. That book goes to 2021, which is when it's published. So it looks at the period of the far right between 2010, roughly, or the Great Financial Crisis, and the middle of the pandemic. But there is so much more that has happened right after that point that we need to cover. So I'm going to be talking sort of about different ways we can get at the problem of the far right on the internet, which is this kind of vast problem. The first one is what I've called here, perhaps slightly grandiosely, sampling the movement, but which I just mean journalism, right? And this is what I am now paid to do. So on Saturday this week, there was a demonstration by Tommy Robinson, People heard of Tony Robertson? Right, like he's like a massive sort of figure in the Anglophone far right. He had a really big demonstration in London, not as big as the previous one, and we went and we spoke to people. So that's one way of sort of approaching the problem, which I've been involved in as a sort of a journalist. The other one is what the book tries to do, which is what I'm calling an account of a developing stack. And by stack here, I mean something like a system that contains various distinct layers. So the classic example here is the internet. Right, you have a layer of physical hardware, and you have a sort of a software layer, and you have an interface layer or a network layer, and then you have a user layer, and you can cut this up in various ways. But the idea is that you can divide a political movement into its fundamental objects, which then get organized and organized and organized in different layers as they increase. Right, that's the kind of the way that the book Post-Internet Far Right tries to get at it, and that's mostly what I'll be talking about today. Then there's also the kind of the way in which a lot of anti-fascist research, so people maybe here are involved in sort of anti-fascist organizations, often try and get at the problem of the far right and understand it, which is mapping the particular concrete network of power relations among groups on the far right. The advantage of this is it's very concrete and very specific. So I'm sure you can say, okay, well, here in Vox, right, there is like this power group and so on, and here they relate to this other. The other problem is that you end up, the problem with this is that you end up essentially writing something like the parish notice boards of the extreme right. You end up sort of a gossip column like Hello Magazine, but for neo-Nazis, right? Where you're like, okay, well, why do I care about these people? They don't like each other, fine. And the thing I'm going to try and do a bit more today is what I've called the final cut, which is the idea of a kind of encyclopedia of mechanisms. So not this kind of grand political ideology. Is this fascism? Is it not fascism? Not this kind of microscopic discussion of how the particular networks are developing, but a collection of mechanisms that we can understand that are repeatable from the Spanish far right to the British far right, to the American far right, to the German far right. All these different places have similar mechanisms that operate, and that's what I'm going to try and do today. So this, of course, is the first one, the first kind of like, this is a video of these people who are at this Tony Robertson demo, and what you find out is that this is like a mentally heterogeneous collection of people that don't really have anything in common. That's a very sort of interesting discovery in some ways. This is the second one. This is the slightly conspiratorial networks of power. This is about Honduras Gate. I was told that Honduras Gate was a big thing in the Spanish-speaking world. Is that the case? People know what this is? No, I was told at lunch earlier. No one's heard of this. Who's heard of Honduras Gate? No? It's really big on like Canal Red. Canal Red Latin America loves this stuff. This is like a really big kind of thing. Anyway, it's a big conspiracy. Look it up. Very exciting. And then, of course, you can do the same thing for the British far right at the moment. This is a diagram that appears on a show that I run, the thing that was mentioned earlier. Do your own research. So, okay, this is the book, the Post-Internet Far Right book. And at the bottom, we start not with the ideas, but with the motivations and the feelings. This is the stack model that I was talking about. Right at the very bottom, we don't have people having clearly defined ideas about the world. What we have are these pre-cognitive urges, these like desires, these vague feelings of unease that need to be turned into something more coherent, more well organized, more explicit, right? That is the task of ideology. And then we move up into the kind of the metapolitical game, into the way in which one spreads one's ideas, one's feelings across the surface of the internet. So that's the kind of the next layer of the stack. Then we have conspiracy theories, whose function is to organize the whole world into something like a coherent single web, a single picture, and so on. Then we have a dynamic that we call in the book the swarm and the influencer, the relation between the crowd of people who don't agree on things, right? Because we are not looking now at the fascist movements of the 20th century, where there was a great deal of ideological consistency. The fascists in, the Nazi Party and Franco Spain and Italy, they had a core set of ideas, right, that were kind of relatively well established. This is not the case anymore for the far right. It's much more heterogeneous, much more chaotic. And so conspiracy theory becomes a way of organizing that heterogeneity into something that makes some degree of sort of sense. Sorry, that's the swarm, the mass of people who are in this sort of heterogeneous way. And then instead of having leaders, like fascist movements in the past, we don't really have leaders anymore, although that's increasingly sort of somewhat the case. We have influencers, people who have a statistical relationship. This is maybe an idea that I'm going to have to go back to, but like instead of saying, you think this, you will do this, there is a persuadability, a kind of an influence operation that happens over people. And that's how the far right gets kind of organized. I will go through this in much more so detail later. Then of course we have the street, which is the unmissable part of the far right. Like you have to have some sort of presence in the street or you are not a real movement, because fascism is an ideology, or the far right more broadly is an ideology that has to demonstrate power in physical space. Without that demonstration, you're just posting on the internet, right? And so there's this constant relationship between the online and the street that we have to keep in mind. And then in the period of say 2016, 2018, 2020, you get new kinds of organizational forms, new parties, things like Generation Identity, which you had a version of in Spain, which is like a pan-European sort of neo-fascist group that maybe people will be familiar with. This is a kind of new innovation. It's not quite a party. It's not quite a movement. It's not a network. It's a sort of different thing that fits in between these different things. And so they have their own kind of weaknesses and their own strengths. And there's the process of intellectualizing, the process of articulating a coherent program out of all this, if you can do it. And then there is, of course, the acts of sort of deadly violence, the terroristic aspects. So when we're thinking about the far right on the internet, right, like there's a kind of a tendency to think about the memes, or a tendency to think about ideas, or a tendency to think about maybe parties. But I'm suggesting there's a much more complex and rich collection of things that we have to think about. And that's how this sort of book gets kind of passed out. The new edition that I mentioned will include leaders and parties, state power, infrastructure, and institutions, but I'm not going to go into those in great detail. The scope is, as I say, the Anglophone far right, 2008 to 2021. Anglophone, of course, doesn't mean English or American. Most of you are not wearing the translation things. I assume you understand what I'm saying. You are part of the potential Anglophone far right. Maybe you're not the far right, but you're part of some sort of potential Anglophone world, right? Like it's not about people in English-speaking countries, right? It's much bigger than that. And obviously, most of Western Europe is contained within that. Okay, so how do we cut this period up, and how do we understand how the far right emerges out of it? Like the obvious cuts are things like 9/11. Why does 9/11 not result in something we think of now as a major far right movement? This is an interesting question, right? Like, why is it that neoconservatism doesn't turn into something we think of as the far right, and we have to wait for much later, right? So there were lots of people at the time who said Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, George Bush, and so on. They are fascists, but they are fascists without a coherent movement. And there's something about the kind of domestic international relation there that I think is kind of interesting to explore. Of course, we do get far right movements in Anglophone world, and indeed in Spain, very obviously, right? After the great financial crisis, that becomes much more prominent, and we get the election of Obama, which is this sort of psychological crisis, of course, for the American far right. And then we get a kind of a new kind of thing called Trumpism. But this is actually surprisingly coherent still. The question that I want to kind of put to you is, like, to what extent are we expecting, has the pandemic really produced a new kind of far right? The pandemic, I don't know how exactly it worked in Spain, but in the UK, it made a lot of people, what's the polite way of saying this? Detach themselves from the ways of thinking, the epistemic regime of conventional society in a way that seems more or less irreversible. It made lots of people mad. Right? That was one of its major consequences. And I don't think that when we think about the far right, we have yet come to terms with the novelty of that form of collective detachment from reality, which is why I'm saying that this is important to this kind of heterogeneity, which you will see if you watch this video, right? Like is very important. There are people in here who believe that Melania Trump, Donald Trump's wife, is Princess Diana. Right? There are people in here who believe that Keir Starmer is a secret Muslim. He's the Prime Minister of the UK. He's not a Muslim, right? But like there are people in here who believe just wild things that even a few years ago we would have like found very surprising. But they're actually much more common than I think is currently understood. And so we haven't yet seen the far right that comes out of this, or we haven't yet, I think, accommodated ourselves or understood that degree of heterogeneity and what it does to our societies. And then, of course, there are other splits. The war in Ukraine is an obvious one. The Gaza genocide has increasingly become a split on the far right, particularly in America, where, of course, Zionism is like a very strongly held ideology of almost all the far right. And then, of course, there's the war in Iran. Okay, so what I'm going to try and do now, for how long do I have left? Not very long. Did I talk too slow, too fast? 10 minutes. My God. 15. I have about 30 slides. So, no, I'm not going to do all of them, don't worry. So we have a kind of encyclopedia of mechanisms. So instead of saying like this happened, then this happened, this happened, this happened, the kind of history, how do we identify mechanisms where things work? And so I want to begin with some of the mechanisms of feeling. And the first claim I want to make is that when we understand far-right feeling, we are looking at a kind of feeling that is constituted by failure. We're constituted by a kind of failure to become a coherent person. And that this is not an aberration, but this is something that is structural to class society. Right? It is an expected mode in which people fall out of the system. They become waste, essentially. They become extraneous to requirements. And this is very visibly the case, right, with things like crisis of youth unemployment, but it's also the case in a much more sort of nebulous and subjective way that for lots of young people, and I'm talking here mostly about young men, that's who comprises mostly the far right, instead of the site of struggle in your life is understood as the site of consumption. There is a sickly bourgeois swamp of experience out there, and you are being sucked into it. Computer games, nicotine, drinking, pornography, gambling on the internet, like polymarket and this kind of like prediction market stuff, right? This is the horrible mire of things. And you as a young man, your task is to resist this and to understand who is behind this, who is trying to drag you down into this pathetic pit of dependency. Right? That is your task as a young man. And that this is the kind of the feeling of failure that drives a lot of the reasons why we see a relationship between self-help on the one hand and far-right ideology on the other hand. Right? This is why Jordan Peterson was such a compelling figure. This is why Andrew Tate is such a compelling figure, because it is a disgusting bourgeois mire you're having to like kind of defend yourself from. Maybe I should try and make this more visceral. But I think there is a real visceralness to it that is very difficult. But this is pathetic, right? The original fascists lost the German side lost the First World War, right? Hundreds of thousands of people were murdered for no reason, and then they believed that they were stabbed in the back and their country was impoverished, and like, you know, that's like a total crisis. In some ways, the meta crisis for the contemporary far right is that there is no crisis. There is no real like thing on that scale. There is no Treaty of Versailles. There is just this slow degrading of meaningfulness and of conventionality, and that produces its own kind of pathologies. So it's not like we are returning to fascism. It's like we are returning to a kind of authoritarianism that can only be built out of a kind of neoliberal achievement subject rather than the mass worker of the early 20th century. Okay, gone on about that enough, and apparently not. So this is what I was saying. Like there is a kind of the way we should think about this is a kind of crisis of consumption. This is a thing that Adorno and Horkheimer write about, right? Which is that particularly when it's looking about anti-Semitism, is that the constitutive illusion of anti-Semitism is that the sphere of consumption, right, is the real place where you are swindled rather than the sphere of production. It is not your boss you have a problem with. It is the person who is trying to sell you the thing that addicts you and so on. Right? And so that returns. And then we have this problem of a community, right? The question of how the far right constructs itself online as a community is, as I'm claiming, a collective self-isolation. It's a way of self-isolating in some sort of wider community. And that is becomes pathological. Right? I'm going to skip metapolitics and aesthetics because I want to say something about conspiracy theorizing, which is that it has become this kind of associative mode of thinking. That is, that there are almost never splits inside conspiracy thinking communities, excepting that one group inside the community starts to believe that another group is part of the conspiracy, right? They are fallen, they're being captured, they're a limited hangout, and so on. So there is no essential limit to what can be conspired about. And this is why I think lots of the analysis of the far right in the last few years has focused on the resuscitation of fascism and the particular kinds of conspiracies that constitute fascism. And this is a mistake, because the kinds of things that are being conspired about, right, are much more various and diverse and strange than that, in a way that is, I think, quite unusual. If we think about this in a climate context, that's important. The way in which, for example, Hurricane Helena was, which is the hurricane that hit America in 2024. Yeah. In 2024, the way that was theorized was not in the old kind of climate denialist way, because that's the conventional way in which we think about the far right being climate denialist. Instead, we got a huge number of conspiracy theories that came out of it. The first one was that there were machines in the Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico, whatever you want to call it, right? In that body of water, there were machines that were producing storms that were producing this hurricane, and that had sort of flooded the United States. Geoengineering as a conspiracy, and the claim I'm going to make here, right, is that instead of thinking at some point climate change will become undeniable, and the people on the far right will have to agree that climate change is real because it will become obvious, the predictive claim I'm making is that no, like the flexibility of conspiracy thinking is so extreme that you can imagine that any climatic phenomena can be explained through some sort of elaborate conspiracy theory, right? I don't think we're going to get to a point at which the broad section of the far right agrees with the conventional story on climate change, because there are so many better stories out there, right? If you're in a sort of associative frame of mind. And so that's the kind of the predictive aspect of this. Yes, and I think also this makes things like debunking, right, like very difficult. And the last thing I'll say on this topic is that there's this final point here, which is that, and maybe this is a difference that we can talk about between the British far right and the Spanish far right, or the kind of Spanish culture more widely. We talked about this at lunch. Is that in early 2026, conspiracy theories, as a methodology for understanding the world, were proven to work because of the Epstein revelations. Right? This is a massive deal in the UK. Our prince was arrested. Obviously, Jeffrey Epstein's had British connections as well. But there is a kind of this is an irrevocable event, right? So alongside the set of schisms here, I think alongside the war in Iran, we should put the idea that the Jeffrey Epstein network being revealed to be true is a kind of thing from which you cannot go back, right? You will always be able to say, it's like if we actually finally found out who killed JFK, and everyone was like, yes, it was the mafia or whatever, then it would be impossible for 100 years to tell people that's a conspiracy theory. Forget about it. And that's the same thing that has happened now. And so I think we are deep, deep, deep into that world where it's almost impossible to understand how the far right will develop without attending not to the idea of fascism as a regulatory ideal that organizes all the thoughts, but to this process of schisming and splitting of epistemic frames more or less indefinitely. Things are going to become much, much madder. And on that position, I will leave things.
Oh, shall I? Oh, well, I don't have my presentation. Do you mind if I stand? Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Saoirse Gallagher. I'm from the United States. It's a pleasure to be here. It was great to hear the talk from Richard. I'm going to be talking about something very similar. So if Richard sort of is on the front lines, has sort of dropped behind enemy lines and is there at the Tommy Robinson gathering, I'm a little bit further back with the supply wagons. So I'm going to be talking about the historical and theoretical armature about some of the things that Richard describes in great detail, including sort of this, what precisely is translating these incoherent feelings about how the world is, how the world ought to be, and is providing guidance on it through dispersed epistemic frames. So I think in particular, one of the hallmarks of our epoch is dispersed epistemic frames. I think the far right in particular has sort of this shattered epistemic frame where once upon a time, as Richard points out, there was at the very least some kind of party structure or leadership structure which gave organization to the ideology of the far right. That's less true these days. So I'm going to be talking about a mechanism for understanding far right thought, focusing and borrowing from how we understand mythology. I think one of the things that we think about when we think about mythology. There we go. One of the things that we think about when we think about mythology as such, it's a very modern way of thinking about mythology to sort of make it coterminous with a lie, right? So when I say myth, the first thing that comes to mind is something which is untrue. I think that's not only unproductive, it's actually counterproductive for thinking about these modes of thought. So myth is not pure knowing falsehood. That's not the structure they play either in myth as it develops in a lot of cultures, nor is it the structure it plays sociologically. They aren't like a motivational ethos, right? Oh, I will say this thing and I'll believe it. Power of positive thinking. Instead, and nor is it actually meant to be like a placeholder for ignorance, right? So there's a very common way of thinking about conspiracy theories as such is they are placeholders for ignorance. They're meant to provide maps of the world, charting out things sort of the way we might chart the gods in the stars. That's not necessarily what they're for either. Myth resembles truth. So it can be true. There are true things in political myths. The Epstein files is one. That's something that did in fact happen. There are false things in political myths, weather machines in the Gulf of Mexico. The point is that the overall narrative as such resembles truth, that it provides a map of how the world is and how the world ought to be. So there are elements of truth and falsehood in it that create this kind of mosaic that provide a map for this fantasia or fantasy land. So Georges Sorel, who wrote as a syndicalist theorist from France, wrote, "Myths at core are not descriptions of things, but expressions of a determination to act." I think that's quite astute. They are maps of reality insofar as they are sort of meant to provide and describe the way things are, sort of chart the world out, organize it, organize pieces of information and so forth. And they are also maps for how to act in reality, how to change it, how to navigate it, and what ought be done, right? So the mechanism that I propose for sort of thinking about this, and this I hope will interact a lot with some of the things that Richard examines in political movements and the internet far right, is a way of thinking about how those pieces of information, how those symbols, those images, those motifs, those reaction images, Wojaks, sort of do and what they do, right? So if we think about what a myth is, a political myth, A political myth is an ideologically marked narrative about the past, present, or future that's sort of ideology in narrative form. So anytime one tries to tell a story, which is ideologically marked in narrative with beginning, a middle, and end, here's how things were, here's how things are, here's how they will or ought to be, we're engaging in political mythology, essentially. And there are sort of three elements to this. One is just sort of very straightforward political elements of it, right? So if I tell a story about weather machines in the Gulf of Mexico, I can tell a story. Once upon a time, there weren't storms like this that ruined New Orleans or North Carolina or Georgia. And now there are. And this is because there's some sort of nefarious NSA or government deep state, which has planted the machines in the Gulf of Mexico. And now there's storms. We will go and we'll storm Washington and we'll root out all the bad actors and good weather will return, right? I've told the story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The explicit political affairs are there. The mythic structure, which political myth shares with religious myth, creation myths, or other kinds of mythologies, is the structure of it being unfalsifiable and non-argumentative, right? So it's not attempting to marshal a whole bunch of evidence, although sometimes that does happen, to marshal a whole bunch of evidence and say, here's how we know there's machines in the Gulf of Mexico. I've taken the photographs here, please look for yourself. It instead provides this kind of mosaic of patchwork information, which is not meant to persuade, but which is meant to create doubt. And it also is mythic in the sense that it expresses, enhances, or codifies a set of beliefs. So in saying it, we participate in it. We become part of the thing that it's meant to represent. So it's like saying a credo or a creed. I say it, so I believe in it, so I am part of the group that believes in it, and so on. And then the other final element of it is deep myth, or if one reads one's Barth's sort of mythologies, the symbolic elements. These are images. This is the tacit substrate of symbols, which undergird myth and mythic thinking. So if you read Roland Barthes' mythologies, where he sort of talks about the very famous French murder, the patriarch who is meant to sort of represent the uncouth Frenchman from the country, the image of the character himself is meant to conjure a set of affective feelings. It's supposed to describe, make us feel a certain way about something. That's that lower sort of substrate. It provides affective orientation to the story itself. So I think this raises a valuable question for how to examine political myth, whether it emerges from online spaces or we're thinking about it historically, particularly in the context of the far right, is essentially, I argue, to read it like literature, to use the tools of literature, to borrow from the structuralists, or if one likes from the Jungians, or if one likes from sort of archetypical literary theorists, to begin to think about these narratives. So any analysis of the things that I think that we're talking about today would be incomplete with talking about the symbols themselves, that sort of symbolic element. So the other thing, perhaps the most important thing about myth, is that it is narrative and character. And in this, it is sort of distinguished from other ways of thinking about history or thinking about the world. It's sort of weird to think about it today, but narrative was not the hegemonic way of thinking about and communicating history for, in fact, a good part of, for instance, European history. So there's this reproduction of a chronicle from the 9th century, which is, I think it's, the Chronicle of Annales, and it's in a book called Content of the Form by Hayden White. And if you look at it, it's essentially just a list. It's like a series of years, right? And that's part of what's interesting about it is if you look at it, there are years where seemingly nothing happens. The list is incomplete. Many of these things are not connected or explained, right? It's merely just a series of bits of information. The natural world is as unexplained as the social world or the political world. They're all sort of disconnected from one another. Time is vertical rather than horizontal. It's not a connection of cause and effect. It is top down from God. It's sort of divine. And so the way of thinking about history, the easy way to think about history is as a series of occurrences which are top down. So narrative, while it's always been here and it's always been a mechanism for telling stories and telling history, has not always been the predominant way for communicating history. One of the things that we share with our kindred on the far right, we as sort of progressives, as people of the left, is that we are products of narrative, of the modernity of narrative. So we can't tell a story about a better world. Richard Rorty sort of calls us on the left the party of hope, right? We can't tell a story of the better world to come unless we engage in political mythology ourselves. We tell a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Once upon a time in the bad old days, there were feudal lords and knights and kings, and they ran roughshod over us. And then we got more rights, and we realized that we needed to organize collectively. And someday in the future, there will be a world without hierarchy and a world without want. That's a political mythology too. It's narrative, right? Our cousins, the reactionaries, also depend on narrative in order to tell their story of decline, of dissolution, of collapse. So Hegel, in Philosophy of History, sort of talks about the twin birth of sort of progress and reaction, of something that comes out of this development of narrative as the hegemonic way of communicating history. So when we look at myth, as I mentioned earlier, part of the thing that we ought to look at is the symbolic, motif, archetype. So motifs are sometimes invoked by the structure of a plot. There's kind of a shared plot or series of plots that one finds sort of all over the Western world when it comes to reactionary politics, right? And it's very, very common. I'll sort of skip ahead, right? So Mark Lilla in The Shipwreck Mind wrote, there's this kind of shared story that one finds in a lot of reactionary politics. Once upon a time, everyone sort of knew their place and worshiped their God, and things were harmonious and structured and hierarchical. And then there were these intellectuals that came along and rabble-roused the masses, and people forgot God and forgot their place. And this is a version of this story is told essentially in every right-wing movement. This kind of shared plot structure invokes shared motifs, shared characters who crop up again and again and again by the structure of the plot. So if one turns to literary studies, for instance, to sort of talk about and think about political mythology, one thing in literary studies that I find useful is this idea of plot-intensive motifs, where you find a similar plot which is shared across different stories. In plotment, you will find a series of shared motifs by the structure of that plot. This is an example for how to sort of diagram a political myth, which is useful, but I won't talk about it too much. But what is the purpose? And Richard pointed this out in his talk. There is some element, there is a mechanism by which incoherent feelings of whether it is despair or joy, the things which are sort of human but incoherent, they've not been turned into political demands, they've not been turned into political understanding. By some mechanism they are. And so part of what I think political myth as a way of studying far-right politics, sort of thinking about far-right narratives does, is to think about how symptoms, right, these symptoms of dissolution, the sort of the bourgeois soup that Richard describes, creates a lot of alienation, a lot of fear, a lot of feeling that only emptiness kind of waits. That's kind of a symptom, to sort of use the psychoanalytical vocabulary, gets turned into meaning through symbol, through using these images or motifs that turn the incoherent feeling into something more positive. So that's where sort of recurring images, symbols, and motifs sort of come into. I don't know if you engage with, for instance, the far right online, there's lots of recurring imagery, sort of image macros, these sort of recurring characters that are a little bit like a commedia dell'arte, right? Whether it is the soy boy, I think that's an outdated term now, but was the case, or NPCs. There's kind of recurring characters that crop up over and over again in far-right online discourse. These images help to produce a certain kind of affective orientation and help sort of ground things, make it easier to recognize by turning to a visual repertoire. So this brings us to today, particularly how to think about what political mythology is doing today. And I think Richard framed it in terms of kind of a shattered, non-shared epistemic view where there is no sort of leader imposing notions about reality per se. However, there is a great blossoming of like multiple different epistemic frames through the internet. There's kind of omni-narrative, this kind of narrative that is not authored by a small group or even one person, but by many, many, many people. And while that's not unusual for how myths are produced, the scale and rapidity with which it's happening through social media, through the internet, means that it's sort of multiplying as a mechanism for translating these ever-growing feelings of alienation into symbols for navigating the world, right? So I concur with Richard that we are in a moment of sort of a spreading epistemic fracture. And because of that, I think it's sort of useful for sort of thinking about the old ways in which that we used to be able to make political understanding and demand. So this is not a new claim. So Anton Jaeger kind of made it very recently, but Robert Putnam made it in the 2000s. Civil society has been hollowed out. There's no more labor unions, no more bird watching clubs, no more bowling leagues that sort of used to provide a person-to-person contact, bylaws, institutional structure that allows us to adopt shared epistemic frames. And so consequently, there's no way to organize and make coherent political demands. Or at the very least, that mechanism is sort of changing and becoming more difficult. It's much more dispersed. So as a result, there's been a growth of free-floating images, symbols that are not connected to a shared narrative, but narrative with kind of shared features, right? So you see the recurring shared elements of it, whether it's weather control might not be a feature of one far-right narrative, but might crop up in a different one. There might be shared characters in one. There might be shared symbols. They might take different shapes, and so on. So I'll sort of borrow from Anton here. So ideological disorientation is the hallmark of the hyper-political age. That's today. Debate erupts over one issue today, another tomorrow, but individuals no longer possess a heuristic capable of unifying and imposing coherence on their various worldviews. Consequently, the way of thinking about the free-floating symbols massively increases in importance. So if these are kind of symbols that are free agents, that aren't attached to institutionalized politics in the sense of labor unions or the old way of thinking about 20th century politics, the symbols themselves, floating free from coherent political demands or coherent viewpoints, serve as the anchor instead, or more meaningful an anchor. So we have symbolic anchors rather than institutional anchors. So what does this mean for thinking about ecofascism or the contemporary right? So in ecofascism, there is sort of this tension between conquest of nature and this desire to return to it. That's the dialectic of ecofascism, is on the one hand, nature must be conquered in order to sort of prove oneself or one's masculinity or whatever else. And nature, on the other hand, needs to be returned to and cultivated, right? So this notion of return to the soil, of live like your ancestors, or how you imagine your ancestors to be. We can think about that in political mythological terms. So the symbol of the unconquered frontier that still waits. You know, one of the reasons that, and it's useful for thinking about the reasons for adopting a particular eco-fascist pose, like climate denial. How is one served in mythological terms by engaging in climate denial on the far right? Well, it's useful in some ways to continue to have endless space through which to conquer, through which to prove oneself, while at the same time having untapped resources to return to. Similarly, with petromasculinity, I think it's very common in sort of the American academia to sort of think about the relationship between masculinity as such and petroleum or oil products and the internal combustion engine, the car as a symbol for freedom. So what work is the car doing, etc. So there is a visual repertoire of man conquering nature, always conquering nature, but at the same time needing to return to it, which is common to ecofascism. I think that this particular approach has legs beyond thinking about ecofascism. I think it provides some basis through which to help examine some of the things that Richard talks about. But that in particular is what I'm presently working on, at least.
Vale, vamos a abrir un turno de preguntas, pero bueno, como tengo el micro, me voy a tomar la licencia de hacer la primera. Vale, la primera que os quería hacer es que las dos, o sea, como que podría abordarla desde distintos lugares, pero voy a intentar ser un poco conciso. En las dos presentaciones, creo que tenemos una idea a veces como de la extrema derecha, una imagen que nos hemos creado como un movimiento excesivamente rígido, que mete a la gente en vereda, que le dice a la gente exactamente lo que tiene que hacer. Y me parece que en las dos presentaciones, es una cosa que a mí me interesa, habéis planteado una imagen de la extrema derecha no tanto como algo, como un movimiento que permite que le dice a la gente lo que tiene que hacer, sino que le permite hacer cosas que antes no podían hacer. Una especie de liberación psicológica. Les permite hacer unas cosas que antes no podían decir o antes no podían hacer. Y pienso, como aquí, como dice Richard, todos somos anglófonos, pienso, por poner dos ejemplos estadounidenses, no me acuerdo en qué año fueron las elecciones en las que Obama se presentaba contra John McCain, que en unas preguntas que le hacían a John McCain en un debate, alguien le fue a preguntar: ¿usted piensa que Obama es árabe? Bueno, la pregunta evidentemente no tiene ningún sentido, pero John McCain dijo: no, esto no se puede decir, esto no está permitido. Y luego hizo una serie de respuestas como: no es árabe porque es un nombre de familia, como si fuera una cosa contradictoria. Pero era como: estas cosas no se pueden decir. Ahora el presidente de Estados Unidos dice este tipo de cosas. Y haciéndolo le permite a la gente decir estas cosas. Y como en un giro... no es como de afines series al psicoanálisis, pero en un giro psicoanalítico un poco más allá, Obama, cuando debatía con Mitt Romney, me parece, tenía un debate sobre quién iba a hacer los portaaviones más grandes, que evidentemente en términos psicoanalíticos no hace falta que os diga a qué hace esto referencia. Ahora Donald Trump habla en sus propios discursos sobre el perfecto funcionamiento de sus genitales. O sea, como lo que antes era subtexto ahora es súper evidente. Entonces, como que la extrema derecha, con sus propios discursos y sus propias acciones, digamos, le está diciendo a la gente: ahora tenéis permiso para hacer todo esto que antes no teníais permiso. Entonces, yo creo que desde la izquierda a veces como que intentamos disputar el término de libertad en los términos un poco sosos, ¿no? Como, no, nosotros la izquierda vamos a permitir, pues vamos a dar libertad para que la gente tenga derecho a una casa, o para que vamos a permitir que la gente tenga acceso a sanidad pública. Eso no está disputando la libertad en el mismo plano en el que está liberando la extrema derecha. Entonces quería preguntaros si creéis que la izquierda o el campo progresista en general puede intervenir en esos términos de liberación. ¿Qué emociones o sentimientos o impulsos reprimidos puede liberar la izquierda frente a lo que libera la extrema derecha? Y no sé si podemos juntar. Bueno, esto es una pregunta un poco amplia, igual podéis ir.
Que vayan contestando.
So when I think about the far right's notion of freedom, right? Freedom takes a much closer, for the far right, takes a character much closer to the medieval concept of freedom in Europe, in the sense that it is a series of privileges. So when we talk about the liberties of lords in Europe in the Middle Ages, frequently talked about their liberties, their freedoms, right? What they mean is privilege in the sense of, I have license to go and do this thing that a different class does not. And that's very different from a sort of 18th century and later kind of French Revolution notion of what freedom is. It's not permission structure based. It's supposed to be, or aspirationally universal. And so it's different in kind and character. I think that the far right invokes this sort of earlier notion of freedom as license, because in part the horizons of universal liberation are in part foreclosed, and in part because the lords of old and the petit bourgeois, whatever kind of class system, thinks about liberty in those terms. So if you go to like the American Civil War, just before the American Civil War, there was a joke that no one talked about freedom more than John C. Calhoun, who was a very prominent supporter of American slavery. He ran several newsletters and newspapers called Liberty, perhaps ironically, and he meant it the same way in terms of license, the license of social superiors to impose themselves. And so I think the left cannot compete in the arena of license. It won't unless we sort of lose our character as the left as such. I think part of what we need to do is to reimagine what universal liberty means in a way that is appealing and becomes more appealing. Richard talked about the bourgeois soup, which is stultifying and unfree, right? So I think the grounds are right to think about universal liberty again, because that resonates, right? This gambling and anomie and all of the issues that sort of face an inhabitant in the contemporary world, which are mire, this incapacity to move. I think one thing that recurs a lot, both the right and the young left too, is this view of the world as incapable of change. There's the internet meme, nothing ever happens. This feeling that we are sort of trapped in the way of doing things forever, that even large events mean that the apple cart won't be upset, that sort of things will reset to the way they were before. There is no sort of major event coming which marks disjuncture. I think part of the thing that makes right-wing permission structure liberty so appealing is this idea that it can serve as disjuncture. It's a little mini disjuncture in our lives rather than universal disjuncture. Although how we move beyond it, I'm not quite sure.
I guess I'm very curious about how this played out in Spain as well, because sorry, I will talk more directly into the microphone. I'm very curious about how this played out in Spain, because in the UK, I feel like we are dominated by an American narrative of the period known as woke, and that woke was a thing that happened, and that it was pushed by the left, and so on. This is not true, right? What is true is that a kind of elite liberalism became pervasive in mainstream American culture, and this is why I'm curious about how it plays out in Spain, because the Americans, do not have a left, right? As such, they have two different wings of capital. They have a nice face wing of capital and the evil looking one, right? And that's the distinction in politics. And so then the nice face was like, you can't say this word, you can't do this thing. Like there was that kind of restriction. And that is, American culture is so hegemonic that it feels like that is what happened everywhere else, although it didn't. Like, I don't remember that happening in the UK in a really serious way. Did it happen in Spain? You guys have a left. You do. Everyone's always like, "Oh no, not our left. It's dreadful." You guys have a very serious left wing, in a way that like the UK and America we would love, but we don't. The point is to say that like I think that it's not a problem of the left in like a proper sense of that term, to struggle with the question of freedom, right? It's a problem of a kind of an elite liberalism, and they have fucked it, right? And have lost that the way any serious attempt to say anything about freedom. But I don't really see it as a problem of the broader left as such. Yeah, I think that there is a kind of a broader swing back towards it. When the way in which it's easiest to talk about this in terms of climate change, right? If that's what we're going to generally to speak about, right? I think is that in the UK at least, like there is this kind of association with the freedom of the car and so on. That is sort of a thing, but it's not like as nearly as prominent as America. And I don't feel like the culture war stuff about like they're going to take your burgers, they're going to take your meat and so on has been nearly as prominent. Maybe it's just like the same thing, but just kind of reduced. And so I don't feel like the struggle is there in the same kind of way in the UK. So maybe I'm not sure about the premise of the question in a sense, but yeah, maybe I misunderstood.
Hi, thank you. I like both of your presentations a lot. And I was thinking about this idea that you brought up about symbols becoming more and more detached, from ideological frameworks, from political ideologies and whatnot. And it left me with the question of, what would be your perspective on, is it easier or more difficult to combat these kind of political myths as they become more detached?
I think in part it becomes harder because they become part of the water supply, as it were, right? Just like the ocean one floats in is now symbol. I think the key issue is that there's this breakdown of authority, both in a good way and a bad way, in the sense that there's no longer really structures that help articulate political demands that are shared, or don't do so in a way that are nearly as organized, right? So you have loose political demands, you have topics of discussion, you have incoherent grievances. So if we think about stultifying workplace or like woke in the UK, right? What is the series of grievances one is trying to really articulate there is an interesting question. Is it a general sensation of, well, I oughtn't say the thing I want to say? Is it a kind of self-policing one is rebelling against? What's the actual demand that one is trying to articulate, the grievance one is trying to articulate? One of the things that I think the detachment of these symbols serves is a way to help articulate incoherent political demands without really articulating a set of grievances. And in that sense, it perhaps is more fertile ground for the far right than it is for the left. So in the sense that symbols provide a way to give the sensation of articulating grievances without actually articulating concrete grievances. I think the left is very good at articulating concrete grievances. Oh, I would like to shorten my working day. I would like to have a say in the operation of industry. I would like to have the right to a divorce, right? These are concrete, articulatable demands that are programmatic in nature. I think the things that free-floating mythic symbols do is they provide a way to gesture at something that is like a grievance without articulating it in a programmatic way. And I think, the anti-woke movement, the UK, could point to very few specific instances of, here is the nanny state coming to silence me in the same way that is articulatable in the United States. However, you can articulate the sensation of grievance without making a programmatic list. Do I think the left can participate in something like that? I think I agree with Richard, and we were talking about this at lunch too, that to some degree, there is this evolution towards making articulatable political demands without the institutions of the 20th century, but it's coming very slowly and in fits and starts. And so I think now it is going to be more easily usable to the right, in part because it's easier to articulate grievances which reify hierarchy than it is to tear it down through such a system. So it's not hopeless, but it means learning a new vocabulary of articulating grievance.
Shall I ask the question as well? Or do you want to? Is it okay? Sorry. Yeah. The question is something like, is it easier or harder because to persuade people of things or to change people's minds because their ideas are more generally detached from reality? And I've been trying to think about the people I met at this march on Saturday. I'm trying to think about, okay, well, what could I persuade them of? And the woman who believed that Melania Trump is Princess Diana, Michael Jackson is a woman and still alive, etc., right? That woman, I think I would struggle to persuade her of something that she didn't already want to think, right? Because there was a kind of a wish fulfillment about what she believes. And there were some people who were fixated on the idea of there being in the UK an enormous crime wave or Muslim rape gangs, which is like the big thing and has been the big thing for a very long time. You definitely can't persuade them that their core claims are not true. So crime in the UK is actually at an all-time low, with much less crime in the UK than there what used to be. But you can't. Don't touch that one. If you want to persuade someone, you have to go around that. You have to persuade them of something entirely different that you also want to persuade them of, where there is some sort of corollary. So you can say something like that. Obviously, a lot of the crime stuff is related to general feelings of insecurity. And if you can articulate a different way of thinking about that insecurity, rather than persuade them, no, we have the statistics, crime is less, that doesn't work. What does work is re-articulating the underlying feeling in some new way that over time, as it plays itself out as a meme in their heads, in their conversations, right? That is a kind of a slower, more gradual way of persuading someone of a different thing, right? So I would say that persuasion doesn't happen head on. People don't, it never happens. But like you can go around the edge, then it doesn't really matter if the thing is true or not true. You can get there. You can insert some new meme, making it sound like Inception now. It's not what I intended to do.
Actually, I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about it, as thinking about it in terms of returning to the symptom, right? So thinking from terms of political mythology, part of what they do is convert this underlying sensation into something that's actionable. And so one needs to return to the sensation. One doesn't need to indulge or try to dissuade, as Richard says, someone who's a young man on the far right from feeling like there's a matriarchy. However, one does need to address this sensation of anomie or despair of being caught in the bourgeois mire. So in that sense, I do agree with Richard.
Anyway, this is like a sort of an iteration of previous questions, but I'm interested in, so maybe like the other side of the coin of myth is transgression, right? So like the far right seems to use transgression a lot, like transgression of things that you cannot say in polite society, of things that should be addressed in a certain way. The examples that Jose Luis was mentioning before, right? And this seems to bring them a feeling of glee, really, like gozo in Spanish, I guess would be the closest word. And it seems like in the left, there's like a dire lack of that, right? Of things that bring you like joy in a primal sense. Now, I imagine like the problem for the far right is that the foundation of that glee is cruelty that you dish out to other people, right? And so you derive pleasure from seeing people being immiserated. So that's probably like not a very good idea for us to mimic, or unless you got like a really good scapegoat that you could like be cruel upon, but it just doesn't seem like a very good course of action. And I wonder what is a way to go around that, right? Is it maybe like I guess maybe trying to be funnier in the face of that glee rather than like showing moral scandal, which is what you usually do, and act in a scandalized way, which feeds into exactly the kind of reaction that they're looking for, to maybe approach it humorously, but at the same time, you can't be too frivolous about these things, right? Because some of these things really matter. I don't know. We have a politician who's like the new star of the Spanish left, and his main virtue seems to be that he's occasionally funny, or that he's like good with memes. He doesn't seem to have like much more in terms of like very profound analysis, I would argue, if you scratch the surface. But that seems to work with a lot of people because, you know, you're sort of like in a depressed environment. It's like, oh, well, you know, at least he like dishes out some good jokes, or he made like a funny comeback. I don't know. I'm sort of thinking out loud, but maybe you have better ideas than me. I hope.
Do you want to start, or? I mean, I think it's useful to kind of separate this idea of attention economy from this notion of sort of dourness or sort of cruel glee. So, like, it's one thing to, I think, say, yes, we do need to be funnier. We need to be more lighthearted in order to reach more people because attention spans are so short. So many things are competing for it. I'm sure it was a difficulty to not look at Instagram while we were talking. There's a desire for there's a need to sort of monopolize attention. And so humor is one way of helping get over that. However, when I think about the issues that face the left in the late 20th century and early 21st century, that the thing that they're articulating they don't like is this sense of defensiveness or school marminess, to sort of use a sexist like way of thinking about it, the sort of like feminized scold kind of way. That the right provides an opportunity for transgression. It's not necessarily funny, but it is joyous, right? So it's fun to watch people you hate be punished, and that's kind of different from being funny, at least I think. The thing that the left, I think, needs to articulate is how do we provide joy, right? So, like, when we try to articulate a political program or an ideological program that brings joy, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a future where there's less work and we spend time more the way we want to? Are we talking about a world in which there's sort of more nature and less sprawl? Are we talking about something aesthetic? Are we talking about something material? Are we talking about working conditions? Are we talking about a reordering of family life? I think part of what it would mean to compete on the terrain of bringing joy is to sort of think to ourselves, what about being on the left helps articulate joy, whether it's, you know, universal joy in the sense of liberation or personal joy in the sense of how will my life change? Because the right is very good at articulating the collective joy of cruelty. So instead, I would sort of challenge and say, what is the equivalent on the left where we sort of talk about a collective or shared joy, right? That, I think, is really the core of the issue, and not so much the being funny, although it doesn't hurt to get more views on Instagram Reels or TikTok, or I don't know if you have any kind of...
Yeah, I think humor is always very important. I think that I was trying to work out what I think it is that brings me joy about being on the left. And I think the thing that that I find really exciting, those maps that you saw earlier, the blue maps, all the kind of the arrows and so on, the big conspiracy map. This is my current project to like map out the entire world in this kind of almost like insane conspiratorial way. But I'm hoping, I'm not sure, but I hope that the completed map, when I've mapped everything that has ever mattered, the shape of that map will be roughly the shape of Marxism. But like, I'm not sure about that. Like, it will resemble Marxism as myth resembles reality. But I think the thing that I find really exciting about thinking about politics and like having political discussions and so on, not necessarily the organizing, but having political discussions, is finding out that the world is like way stranger and bigger and more diverse and like complex and exciting and novel than I thought before. And I feel like a lot of the disciplinary culture on the left consists of asserting a position of authority where you're like, I know how the world is organized, and I'm going to tell you that if you transgress how the world is organized in my head, then there's a problem there. But like, there is a kind of like I think the real source of joy is a kind of excitement in novelty. And the problem that this is speaking extremely personally, but the kind of the ways in which people think about joy on the left, or collective joy, often just like looks like very, very samey, and like very sort of similar, and not like monster trucks and things that make you go like, or shooting guns and so on, which, you know, you go like, hell yeah, you know? And the right is very good at like, hell yeah, you know? But it's like about care and the family and so on. I'm like, yeah, sure, but like guns, monster trucks.
Yeah, in many ways, the family, the sort of the mythologized family structure is a great patina in front of the guns and monster trucks. And so I don't know, when I think about joy on the left and sort of visions of joy, it's not enough, I think, to sort of articulate a reduction of suffering, some kind of in a net way or an abstract way, in the sense of we will implement a policy and fewer people will get hurt. It's necessary, I think, to have an aesthetic of joy. The right, of course, has guns, monster trucks, cruelty, the car engine. There's an aesthetics of joy. I think the left has lost its way in describing an aesthetic of joy. It's kind of, you know, dancing is meant to be kind of liberatory, right? And I think the terrain of competition is looking for symbols of joy that help create a constellation in one's mind of what the free life looks like. You know, a vision of the free life on the left. You know, what does the world of the left look like? If you try to describe a world in which there's, I don't know, there's a lower infant mortality rate, or there's, you know, more high-speed rail, or there's cheaper or free energy, that's not enough, because it's not an aesthetic of a life, which is how most people process information, is through the visual, the mythological, the symbolic. What is the symbol of left joy, I think, is the real question to ask. And I think once it's found, it becomes easier to compete on that terrain with the right.
¿Estáis? Voy a aterrizar mucho a la realidad española y voy a abandonar un poco el marco teórico. Una de las grandes batallas que se produce entre la derecha y la extrema derecha, que aquí se confunde muchas veces, es el campo, el medio rural, el sector primario, donde la extrema derecha encontró un filón de descontentos, de gente olvidada, de gente lejana, porque vive muy lejos del centro de decisión, donde las tradiciones son fundamentales, son símbolos. La caza, la tauromaquia, las tradiciones religiosas, que no la fe cristiana, sino las tradiciones, las procesiones, y incluso la protección de especies como el lobo. O sea, son símbolos que ilustran un sentimiento de víctimas, de gente olvidada, de la España silenciada, donde el enemigo es los ecologistas, la izquierda, el Pacto Verde y la Agenda 2030. Este es uno de los filones de votos de la extrema derecha en España. Los hay. Hoy en las zonas con emigración, el tema de la masculinidad atacada también es otro filón, pero el campo es ahora mismo un granero de votos de la extrema derecha. Mi pregunta es ¿estaremos haciendo algo mal los promotores del Pacto Verde, de la transición ecológica, de la defensa del medio ambiente, para que una parte de los habitantes del medio rural sientan que han sido abandonados?
I want to start first each time.
I think there will. So maybe 10 years ago, I remember people telling me in the climate movement. They told me fossil fuels equals capitalism, solar panels equals socialism, and this is nonsense, right? And it was obviously nonsense. And like, I think that's just like I don't agree with that analysis at all. Any energy system will have contradictions around it. It will, it will produce class antagonisms and so on. I don't think you're doing anything wrong necessarily. I don't know enough about the details of how that is happening in Spain. My understanding is that there is something of a sort of backlash, even on the left, about renewable energy. Is that right? Or is it mostly on the right, but it's also on the left? It's on the left, right? Without knowing the details, I don't really think I can answer the question. But I don't think you should expect something as fundamental as an energy transition to not have losers, right? It's a profound industrial change. It's an industrial change that is happening faster and probably better in Spain than most other countries, in part because you have lots of sun, right? But I think you should definitely not expect to have zero victims. Yeah, I don't know about the specifics. I mean, like, what is the ownership structure? So, do people in the rural areas do they own the solar panels? No. Okay, well, that's the point I would push on, right? I'd be like, you will own something of this infrastructure when it is built. We understand that it destroys the environment that you care about, right? But we will advocate for you to own it and to benefit directly from it in some very clear way. That's, I think, the missing piece, because big capital will, of course, impose the conditions that it wants to impose, and that will rebound mostly on the left, in the same way as like woke, which was imposed by HR departments and not the left, right, will rebound on the left, right? It's similar kind of dynamic. Yeah, you should expect it, but I don't think you're doing anything wrong.
Yeah, and I would concur with Richard broadly that there are, we also need to look at sort of the last major series of industrial and energy transitions, which is the 19th and early 20th centuries, where the primary losers were also rural people who lost. They went into major cities in large numbers. They had to work in industry. I think, for instance, in Dublin, the city death rate was much higher than the rural death rate by a lot. But nonetheless, the city kept growing because so many people were coming in from the countryside. It was a whole way of organizing production that just collapsed. And in the United States, we have something very similar, sort of, or at least there's this, there's on the one hand, the voters, right? The actual vote totals show that in exurban, that is areas outside the suburbs, but not truly rural, and rural voters are by far the largest supporters of the right in the United States. Then there's the archetype of the aggrieved rural voter, or the symbol of the aggrieved rural voter, who is kind of itself kind of a motif of like the kinds of grievances they hold, where it's like this notion of the family farmer who is aggrieved and just trying to get by. And to some extent, that's also an invention. And to some extent, there are, of course, grievances in the rural areas. The question is, some of them are symbolic ones, some of them are material ones. I think that I want to push back a little bit on what Richard said insofar as the model of ownership, for instance, I think is a mostly good idea. But even in the United States, where farmers sort of can directly own solar panels that are installed, or at least that's one of the efforts that was the case in the United States in the 2010s was, we'll pay farmers, you will own some of the solar panels we install that will directly reduce your electricity bill. There was still pushback even then. And when asked why, I think one of the major responses was sort of the symbolic of what the solar panel represented. So this, even when the farmers directly owned the solar panel, even when the installation directly reduced the farmer's utility bill, even when it was installed where the farmer gave permission, you will see all over the rural United States in the 2010s and still today, pushes to ban solar panels on farms, including ones which are voluntarily placed there. Why? I think because of sort of the symbolic and totemic reality, like question of what they represent, which is they represent urbanity, they represent effeminacy, they represent the end of the car of that particular vision of license and freedom. And so I think there's two ways to deal with it. You can either, sort of as Richard points out, go around the direct belief and sort of try to articulate what it is they're actually looking for, which is, will I still get to, in this world which is coming, will I still get to be myself? And you can either say, yes, and here's how, or you can say, no, but you can't sort of wish it away, even with direct ownership of solar panels.
Es que tenemos que acabar ya porque son 1:30. Tenemos que acabar porque tenemos que hacer una pausa de 5 minutos para la siguiente mesa. Además, por la traducción tenemos que cortar, tiene que ser 1:30 de charla. Nada, pues hacemos una pausa de 5 minutos y nos vemos en la siguiente mesa.